Hello. In this lecture, we will study the first chapter of the book of Joshua. As you can see in the share screen, I put up some questions. I strongly suggest that before listening to the lecture, you read chapter 1 and relate to the questions on the shared screen, because we will not actually read the whole text, and therefore it's important as background to be prepared and read it yourselves. So Joshua, of course, is the first book of the prophets and follows right after the Torah. And it's interesting to compare the end of Torah to the beginning of the book of Joshua. So let us do a new share and see the last verses in the Torah. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 34. So we're informed that Moses is about to die. God tells him that he will not be crossing over the Jordan into the promised land. So he showed him the land, and then Moses, the servant of the Lord, Eved Hashem in Hebrew, died there in the land of Moab by the mouth of the Lord. He's buried. And we have some words summarizing the greatness of Moses, that he was the greatest of the prophets. And we're informed as well about Joshua. And Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands upon him. And the children of Israel obeyed him, and they did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And then there's a summary, and there was no other prophet who arose in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, etc. And this is the end of Torah. So Moses dies. We're informed that Joshua now is full of the spirit of wisdom and is going to take over for Moses. And this is the end of Torah. On somewhat of a tragic note, Moses does not enter the promised land. He only sees it, but he will not enter it, and then he dies. And this brings us to the opening of the book of Joshua. And it was after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, Moses, my servant, has died, and now arise, cross this Jordan, you and all this nation, to the land which I give the children of Israel. So, first of all, we can immediately see that the first chapter of Joshua follows suit on the final chapter of the Torah. It's as if it's just a straight continuation. And now immediately the journey continues, and they are about to cross the Jordan. Note here as well, Moses once again is called the servant of God in Hebrew, Moshe Avdi, and it's twice. It's also mentioned in the first verse, Eved Hashem, the servant of God, right? And as well, in verse 2, my servant, right? Literally, it could be translated even slave of God. It's even more powerful, beyond servant. In Torah, perhaps somewhat paradoxically, the highest title one can earn is slave of God. Very few have earned that title. One of them, of course, being Moses. And this is the background to the beginning of the book of Joshua, and particularly the opening chapter, because the opening chapter of Joshua is actually composed of a speech, a long speech by God to Joshua, and then a couple of verses in which Joshua prepares the people to cross the Jordan, and then another speech, a dialogue between Joshua and a certain group from the people of Israel. So it's basically a chapter of speeches. And of course, this immediately connects between Joshua and the book of Deuteronomy, because the book of Deuteronomy is very much a book of speeches, the speeches of Moses to the people. And as we saw in the introductory lecture, many modern scholars following the position of Martin Noth have viewed an intricate connection between Deuteronomy and Joshua and have seen them both as part of the Deuteronomistic history, hence the concept of a Tetrarch. There are only 4 books of the Torah, and then Deuteronomy begins with the Deuteronomistic history. Now, in the Jewish tradition, as well as the Christian tradition, that's not the case. And the book of the Torah is bounded by Moses himself. That's what gives it its special status, the highest prophet. But there are indeed strong connections between Deuteronomy and Joshua, and one of them relates to the formative speeches. Now, what we can note right away is that even though Moses has died, he is very much in the picture. And to a large extent, the purpose of this speech, which is directed to Joshua, and hence it's slightly different. It's not a speech to the people of Israel. It's a speech to Joshua himself by God. The content is very much directed at encouraging Joshua because of Moses' absence. Indeed, the perhaps central word, the key word in this chapter is Moses. It appears no less than 11 times in the chapter. You could see it right off the bat, right? After the death of Moses, Moses, my servant, has died, right? And continuing on through the chapter, that Moses, my servant, has commanded you the Torah of Moses, right? In other words, Moses, even though he has died, is very much present and actually even dominant in the chapter. Notice even at the end, remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, said, Moses gave you on this side of the Jordan, and etc. Look at the very conclusion of the chapter. Only that the Lord your God be with you as he has with Moses. Representatives here of the people speak to Joshua. So Moses is a key figure. And this is very understandable because he has just died. And we know, the role that Moses had for the people. He was representative of God. And we also remember what happened the previous time he disappeared, when he went up the mountain, disappeared for 40 days. We know that the people lost heart, and that led to the sin of the golden calf. So not surprisingly, the death of Moses here has a great impact and requires much encouragement. And that is exactly what's going on in the opening chapter. If we analyze the structure of the chapter, we can see basically it breaks up into 3 sections. The first section is the lengthiest, the speech of God to Joshua, the leader. That's from verses 1 to 9 inclusive. Then verses 10, 11, Joshua speaks to the representative leaders in order to prepare for movement, continue on in their journey to cross the Jordan River. And finally, the last verses from verse 12 to 19 is the dialogue that Joshua has with the 2.5 tribes that actually decided that they wanted to live on the eastern banks of the Jordan and not cross. Now, this structure is very important because the first section, the first 9 verses, basically shows how God elected Joshua and is encouraging him to be the leader, promising to be with him. Right, so that shows how Joshua is indeed the elected leader and by the will of God. But very interestingly, the last section shifts the focus from God to the relationship between Joshua and the people. And here, Joshua speaks to representatives of the 2.5 tribes. Those are the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Why does he speak specifically to these 2.5 tribes and not the rest of Israel? Well, that is understood in light of their background. Like we said, in Numbers, in the book of Numbers, we see that Moses agreed to let these 2.5 tribes inherit the land on the east of the Jordan. They came here, we can see the beginning of the chapter, the descendants of Reuben and Gad had an abundance of livestock, very numerous. And they saw the land of Yazer and the land of Gilad, and behold, the place was a place of livestock. Right? And therefore they spoke to Moses and to Eleazar and to all the princes. And what do they say? Well, these lands, all the names of these places, the land that the Lord struck down before the congregation of Israel is a land for livestock, and your servants have livestock. They said, if it pleases you, let this land be given to your servants as a heritage. Do not take us across the Jordan. So they suddenly don't want to continue the journey. They're happy with the land that they see on the eastern banks of the Jordan River. Moses, of course, is furious, and he warns them of the consequences, right? This can be viewed as a rebellion. And he reproaches them. If you turn away from following him, God, he will leave you in the desert again, and you will destroy this entire people. You could bring tragedy upon yourself and upon all of the people. And then they recalculate, and they have an alternative offer. They approached him and said, we will build sheepfolds, gates for our livestock here, and cities for our children. Notice the emphasis first on livestock and then children. We will then arm ourselves quickly and go before the children of Israel until we have brought them to their place. Our children will reside in the fortified cities on account of the inhabitants of the land. We shall not return to our homes until each of the children of Israel has taken possession of his inheritance, for we will not inherit with them on the other side of the Jordan and beyond, because our inheritance has come to us on the east bank of the Jordan. So now they say we are willing to cross with the Israelites. We'll leave our children and flock here, and we will fight, and then only afterwards we'll return, but we don't want to inherit land on the west of the Jordan. Moses eventually agrees. He kind of changes the order and says, okay, look out for your children first, and then your livestock. And here, this brings us right back to our situation, because here is the actual point of filling up that promise, because the Israelites are about to cross the Jordan River. Will the 2.5 tribes live up to their promise? And hence what we see here is that Joshua speaks to the representatives of the people, but one may say that this is the weak link in the people, because they're the ones who are least motivated to continue, because they've already reached their destination. They're happy to remain on the east. But going back to the understanding of this structure, basically, I think what's behind it is a very important message about the conception of leadership. And this is what our chapter is very much about, the leader. It is clearly evident that the leader should be desired by God. And this is what the whole speech of God to Joshua shows. That's necessary, but that's not sufficient. It's not enough that God desires a leader. It is just as important that the people accept their leader. And what the structure of our chapter shows is, first part, that Joshua is desired by God, but the last part is that Joshua is desired by the people, and this is representative by the weakest link in the people, those who are least motivated to continue with Joshua, the 2.5 tribes who basically would prefer remaining on the east banks of the Jordan River. So after we saw the key word in the first chapter, namely the word Moses, 11 times, right, throughout the chapter, we can move on now to analyze a key phrase in the chapter that's repeated 4 times. What is that phrase? It is the words of encouragement by God to Joshua in the beginning. Namely, you can see it in green, chazak ve'ematz, translated, be strong and have courage. And if we look at the words of God to Joshua, several times he tells him, like in verse 6, be strong and have courage, for you will cause this nation to inherit the land that I've sworn to their ancestors to give them. So here he's encouraged to be strong and have courage in relation to inheriting the land. And then in verse 7, once again we have that same phrase, but this time in a different context. Just be strong and very courageous, to observe and do in accordance with all of the Torah that Moses, my servant, has commanded you. Do not stray therefrom, right or left, in order that you succeed wherever you go. So here, Joshua is told to be strong and courageous in relation to keeping the Torah. In the previous words, it was in relation to inheriting the land. And this is the 3rd time found in the speech of God to Joshua. Did I not command you? Be strong and have courage. Do not fear and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. We see how God emphasizes that he will be with Joshua and constantly tells Joshua, be strong and have courage. Fascinatingly, these same words are also found in the dialogue between Joshua and representatives of the 2.5 tribes at the end of the chapter. When the 2.5 tribes answered Joshua, who reminded them of their promises to Moses, that they'll continue and cross to the west and help their fellow brothers conquer the land and only then return to the east. So Joshua reminds them of that promise, and then they answer him. And they answer Joshua saying, all that you have commanded us, we shall do, and wherever you send us, we shall go. Total commitment. Just as we obeyed Moses in everything, so shall we obey you. Notice the character of Moses in the background here. Only that the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. That is what they want, to make sure that God will be with Joshua just as he was with Moses. And then they conclude by saying, every man that shall rebel against your words and will not listen to your commands in all that you order him shall be put to death. Only be strong and have courage. They also implore Joshua to be strong and have courage. In other words, 4 times we see these words of encouragement, 3 times by God to Joshua and once by the 2.5 tribes to Joshua. The preponderance of this term, right, obviously teaches us what is necessary here and what's at stake. Joshua needs a lot of encouragement, and that is because he feels, intimidated by the role of the need to fill in the shoes of Moses. right? And we can see that the people are also very concerned. They say, we're with you. We identify with our mission. We're willing to continue, but we just have one request, and that is that God be with you like he was with Moses. In other words, their concern is that God was with them because of Moses. Moses represented for them, the presence of God, and the fear is that once he disappears, maybe God will no longer be with the people, and therefore there's a great need for encouragement here, and this is first directed by God to Joshua. He will be with him indeed, as he was with Moses, and this is what the people want. They're willing to be with Joshua, but on one condition, that also God will continue being with them. And here we can see via the necessity of these repetitive words of encouragement, right? The state of the people, their fear, their trepidation once Moses has passed away. What's very interesting is also to understand the concept of strength here in light of the different contexts. We can see here, on the one hand, God tells Joshua to be strong and have courage in his mission to conquer the land. That could be placed in the context of the military conflict that awaits them. One needs strength and courage to succeed in war. And that is the typical, perspective on power, military strength. But side by side with the words of encouragement in relation to the conquest of the land, be strong and have courage, for you will cause a nation to inherit the land, comes another statement, right? God implores, be strong and have courage to observe and do in accordance with all the Torah. And here we can see the concept of power as depicted in the book of Joshua, and specifically in this speech, is one that combines both, we can say, military prowess with spiritual, strength, right? Strength and courage is necessary on both on the battlefield, but also in abiding the Torah and keeping the commands of God. And the combination of the two is the recipe, right, for success. Only both, contexts promise success on the part of Joshua. Military strength alone will not be enough. Just like, I guess, spiritual strength alone will not be enough. We need strength and courage in both domains. That is exactly what is behind these words of encouragement by God. Now, this, I could say, double conception of power in the book of Joshua actually correlates nicely with the character of Joshua. Because if we recall the depiction of Joshua in the Torah, 5 books, we note that Joshua has this dual aspect to him. On the one hand, he's a military commander. He's the one who led the army in the battlefield against the Amalekites after the exodus from Egypt. And he's the one that overcame the Amalekites by sword. So he's obviously got military prowess. At the same time, he's also the one who's depicted as a student of Moses, the pupil of Moses, who doesn't leave the tent, goes up on the mountain with Moses. And so it's exactly the character of Joshua that has within it that double aspect of strength and courage on the battlefield, and also strength and spiritual courage that puts him in the right place, the right person at the right time to fulfill all the goals ahead for the Jewish people. Now, the focus on commitment to Torah is very much, I guess, characteristic of the Deuteronomistic history, and particularly, of course, of the book of Deuteronomy. So let's just reread those words of God to Joshua about keeping to Torah, right? In verse 7 and 8. Just be strong and very courageous to observe and do in accordance with all of the Torah that Moses, my servant, has commanded you. Do not stray therefrom right or left, in order that you succeed wherever you go. This book of the Torah shall not leave your mouth. You shall meditate therein day and night, in order that you observe to do all that is written in it. For then will you succeed in all your ways, and then will you prosper. Now, this speech of encouragement to keep Torah is very much reminiscent of what we find in general in many places in the book of Deuteronomy, right? You have to speak and the words of Torah day and night, right? Reminiscent of famous verses that we all are familiar with in Deuteronomy, from the Shema as well. You should read and speak the Torah, right, when you're in your house and when you're on your journey, when you go to sleep and when you wake up. This is very much characteristic of the rhetoric and vision of Deuteronomy. And here we can see more examples of what led many scholars to draw a connection between the book of Joshua, and particularly the parts related to the speeches in Joshua, with a similar outlook, right, and emphasis on Torah as we find particularly in the book of Deuteronomy. And I want to share with you just one example, which I think is very striking and connects exactly with what we read here, in particular, the issue of not straying right or left. This is very reminiscent of another command that we find in the book of Deuteronomy, this time in Deuteronomy 17. So Deuteronomy 17 begins with commandments related to their entering into the land, talking from verse 14 and onwards. When you come to the land the Lord your God is giving you, you possess it and live therein, and you say, I will set a king over myself, like all the nations around me. You shall set a king over you. So God allows the Israelites, if they want, to set a monarchy, a kingdom over them. But then he puts some limitations and some commandments directed towards that king. And one of them is as follows, in verse 18. And it will be, when he sits upon his royal throne, that he shall write for himself two copies of this Torah. I prefer copy of this Torah on a scroll from that Torah, which is before the Levitic Kohanim. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this Torah and these statutes, to perform them, so that his heart will not be haughty over his brothers, and so that he will not turn away from the commandment either to the right or to the left, in order that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his sons among Israel. So, of course, it's very striking here. The commandment for the king is to have a copy of that Torah, and he has to read it all the days of his life, in order that the words are totally absorbed within him, so that he remember his commitment and not become haughty over his brothers and attempt to put limitations on the king. He has to be subservient to the Torah, right? And he's obliged to keep the Torah. If you will, this is somewhat reminiscent of the attempt in the English kingdom to put limitations on royalty, if you will, the Magna Carta and Bishop Stephen Langton putting limitations upon the king. He's also obliged to the law. Perhaps as a religious person, he was also influenced by the position of Deuteronomy. But here we can see very much the similarity between what God prescribes for the king of having a copy of the Torah and reading it so that he doesn't stray to the left or to the right, and what God says to Joshua, he has to be strong and courageous in keeping the Torah so that, again, he doesn't stray to the left or to the right, right? And the comparison of the two not only shows, the common perspective and similarities between them, but also shows that Joshua is very much perceived as a king, like a king, and therefore he has commandments that are quite similar to those commandments prescribed when the Israelites decide that they want to have a king over them. And I want to conclude now with another key word, a light word in the chapter. We began with the key word Moses, and we moved on to the key phrase, Chazak ve'ematz, be strong and be courageous. Well, there's one more key word, and it's even more prevalent in the first chapter. It's a common word, small word found in many chapters, perhaps almost all, but here it's so prevalent. It's obviously something that is indicative of the outlook of this chapter. And I'm referring to that small word, the word kol, which in Hebrew, which means all. So here I've highlighted it for you. The word kol, all, appears no less than 14 times in Joshua chapter 1, which is pretty impressive. And it's interesting to try to note where it appears in what context, right? So if you read through, I think one can divide the appearance of the word kol, all, into 4 categories. What are they? Well, let's take a look, for example, in the beginning. When God speaks to Joshua, he says, Moses, my servant, has died, and now rise, cross this Jordan, you and all this nation. So here, all refers to all the people. And later on in verse 3, he says, all places in which the soles of your feet will tread, I have given to you. In other words, getting all the land. And that's also the case in verse 4. All the land of the Hittites to the great sea westward, you will inherit. It'll be your borders, right? If we break up all these appearances, I think this small word can reveal to us perhaps the recipe for success, the equation for success. So let's try to place them in the different categories. And my proposal is to try to break them up into the following 4 types. There's all the land, there's all success, there's all the Torah, all that is commanded, and there's all the people, right? If we break them up into the different categories, right? The 14 appearances, I think, right, we can come up with the following equation. What this opening chapter wants to teach us is that if all the people keep all the Torah, all the commandments, the result will be all the success and all the land. That, I think, is what is behind this chapter and the preponderance of appearances of that word kol, total, right, throughout the chapter. The perspective is one that is all-encompassing. The opening chapter not only encourages Joshua as leader, but also sets the goals and also determines the way for success. The goal is to cross the Jordan and inherit the land, the promised land. The manner, the key to success is if we have all the people keeping all the commandments. then the result will be all success in all the land, right? In other words, the book of Joshua sees great importance in unity of the people, and in commitment to following the words of God. And those two components promise a successful accomplishment of all the goals awaiting Joshua and the people. So this is the opening chapter, which, first of all, establishes Joshua as the elected leader, both by God and by the people, as representative by the 2.5 tribes accepting Joshua's leadership. And at the same time, it also sets the goals and sets the path to success for the leader who will fill in the great shoes of Moses, the previous leader, who is no longer. How will Joshua live up to all these expectations? Will the Israelites succeed? Well, that we will see as we continue on our journey through the book of Joshua.